Birth rates are declining everywhere. Among right-wing circles, there has long been a discussion of how the West is not reproducing itself and is quickly being replaced, but taking a look at populations in East Asia, India, the Middle East, Latin America, and even in Africa, and this trend of falling birth rates is universal. The key difference with the West is that this decline is occurring alongside waves of mass immigration, contributing to an increased awareness in Western countries of their own population's shrinkage. Now, the cause for this decline is baffling to many, with theories ranging from environmental pollutants to antenatal social norms and even economic circumstances like inability to afford a home or get a good job to support a family on a single income. Hand in hand with these theories are all manner of proposed solutions to what some have called the demographic crisis. There is a fear that this crisis could ultimately spell the extinction of humanity, but apparently more concerning to many than the possible end of the human race are the short-term impacts. How can you sustain services like Social Security if the youth population keeps shrinking? How are we going to maintain a competitive economy if our labor force keeps getting smaller? How do we project military strength if our armies are a fraction of what they used to be? It may shock you to hear this, but we don't really need to worry about any of that, and I'm going to explain why in great detail to hopefully alleviate your fears and point out what does need to be focused on if we want to avoid any of those worst-case scenarios. This is a topic I've covered before and something I paid close attention to because, like many are now panicking over, I thought this was a much more serious situation than it actually was. Yes, there's some major problems we need to solve, and unfortunately no one in major positions of power is advocating for solving all of them at once. But there's some optimistic signs that we're gradually moving in the right direction. Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another video for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos like this every week on history and politics, so remember to give us a like, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned. Now, if we're going to be discussing the declining global birth rates, this might be a good opportunity to offer you fellas a guide to rebuilding civilization should the worst befall us. Literally the ultimate guide to rebuilding a civilization, or as the good folks over at Hungry Minds like to call it, the book. This giant codex is some 400 pages of hand-drawn illustrations providing a general guide on how to reproduce some of mankind's greatest inventions and discoveries. From how to create fire, to how to preserve foods, to how a combustion engine works, and much, much, much more. This is easily one of the most unique books I've ever seen. If anyone's ever heard of it, this feels like turning the pages of the Voynich manuscript, but if it was put together by a cross between Leonardo da Vinci, Nikola Tesla, and a disgruntled cartoonist. I'm Pickle Rick! It's just beautifully weird in its own way while still being a fun resource of facts you didn't even know that you were curious about. If the West actually does end up falling, you're gonna want to have your hands on this, and if nothing ever happens, hey, you're still the proud owner of a really cool looking book. It's really a work of art as much as it is an enjoyable read, and I'm considering this a bit of a birthday present for myself because honestly, what a great gift this is. Fellas, you can pick this bestseller up at a 10% discount when you follow my link in the description and use promo code mr.z at checkout. Go ahead, click the link. We'll get back to the video in just a second. Did you click the link? Alrighty. Let's get right back to the video. This is going to upset some people, but in very simple terms. The population or demographic crisis is the right-wing equivalent to the climate crisis. Yes, there is a real phenomenon we are observing, be it declining birth rates or changes to the climate. Yes, in an absolute worst-case scenario, both crises could lead to the extinction of humanity, but honestly, what worst-case scenario wouldn't? The average person crusading against either of these crises actually has no idea what's really causing it. Most of the proposed approaches to solving the crises are actually only slightly effective and make no real change, and finally there's nothing we can sensibly do to stop them. And I'll stress that word sensibly, because honestly if you really wanted to, you could increase your country's fertility rate just about as practically as you could net zero your country's carbon emissions. Yeah, it's doable, but it's not practical, at least not for now. And just like this would only slightly mitigate climate change, you'd only slightly be above replacement level fertility rates. So what proposed solutions have people put forward to solve this issue? We'll start with the most faulty one, which is immigration appears to have been adopted by various Western governments, yes, as a means of humanitarian support to populations seeking better opportunity, but within certain circles there's a very evident recognition of population decline and the use of immigration as a perceived solution. It's clear enough to see in political arguments and slogans like, "Immigration is the source of our strength. Americans don't want to work those jobs. We need to recruit the top talent wherever they may be," and of course the infamous, "American culture has venerated mediocrity over excellence for far too long." This perception frames the demographic decline as a numbers issue, one that can be solved by just adding more numbers now from other countries. It's a view that tends to see people of different cultures as easily interchangeable units of labor, or on the more optimistic side believes assimilation into, for example, American culture is total, universal, and consistent. Importation of more raw labor does not solve the root problem. The root problem is that people here are not having children. If anything, this exacerbates the problem, as more adult laborers means less housing, fewer jobs, and more competition with native citizens, which contributes to economic circumstances which delay starting a family. The only people this helps are the aged and the economic elite, as you import not only more laborers for large corporations, but more laborers paying into Social Security and other government funds. This is the difference between legal and illegal immigration. Illegal immigration is good for big businesses seeking cheap labor. Legal immigration is okay for business because they still get more labor, but it's especially good for the government, who gets more taxpayers. But both types of immigration ultimately hurt the native citizen. It's not a good strategy. What strategies actually help raise the fertility rate? The idea of using baby bonuses or government subsidization to stimulate a new baby boom is well-meaning and ultimately a net positive for families, but insofar as its ability to raise the fertility rate, it may be futile. Hungary is probably the poster child and inspiration for many looking to follow suit, as under Viktor Orban, the country implemented massive reforms to benefit families, including tax breaks, even eliminating the income tax for larger families, subsidizing home ownership for married couples, subsidizing medical care for children, a child care allowance which basically allows one parent to stay at home and still receive an income. The list goes on. But the real question is, how effective has this been? Well, Hungary went from a fertility rate low of 1.2 to a 3-decade high of 1.6 before falling back to 1.5. To Orban's credit, he stopped the bleeding for now, and these policies are absolutely beneficial to those populations starting families, but the country is still below replacement. Maybe we just need to try again, you might say. France had implemented similar policies in the early 1900s and then doubled down on those policies in 1994. The fertility rate rose from 1.66 to 1.68. Germany, 2007, rose from 1.33 to 1.4. South Korea, 2006, the fertility rate fell from 1.1 then to 0.7 today. Japan, 1994, fertility rate went from 1.5 then to 1.2 today. Australia, 2004, fell from 1.7 to 1.5. Russia 2007, 1.4 then and 1.4 now. Singapore 2001, 1.4 down to 1 today. And how about a familiar one? Here in the United States, the closest thing we've had up until recently was the child tax credit passed in 1997. The fertility rate fell from 1.97 then to 1.6 today. Should we just keep trying? I mean, we might as well. I appreciate what these credits, programs, and subsidies do. They're absolutely helping young families who are just starting off, and they may help offset rapid fertility rate fall-offs, but clearly they're not having the intended effect of restoring replacement-level birth rates. Hungary shows us that, yes, home ownership, steady income, stay-at-home opportunities, basically taking all the economic strain out of child raising and even offering economic incentive helps, but it doesn't motivate people to start having 2.5 children again. So what does? Carl Benjamin, or Sargon of Akkad, made a video some weeks ago essentially chalking up declining fertility rates to a matter of status. Not to take the wind out of his sails so quickly, but this suggestion that this declining birth rates is exclusively a Western issue misses the point that it isn't just a problem with how Western cultures view motherhood or with the lack of so-called family or child-friendly spaces. The decline is rooted in something a lot deeper, which is impacting everyone, not just Western societies. Now, in the video, he goes on to reference a woman who proposed the problem was the West's celebration of promiscuity in contrast to its low-status view of motherhood. She brought up Mongolia as a prime example and model to follow, but this seems to have been a bad anecdote. India is a country that celebrates motherhood. Russia is a country that celebrates motherhood. Iran is a country that celebrates motherhood. And yet all of them, Mongolia included, are facing birth rate decline. Yes, there was a little spike recently, but it's since been declining, and it's following a very similar trend to other countries in the Central Asian steppe. The matter of social honors which Carl brings up in the video, yeah, Russia has one of those, France has one of those, they're not really putting much of a dent in the numbers though. The point about women being less active in community building, maybe there's a point to that. It's true that social clubs and a lot of these local societies that women were involved with in their free time have dried up, but it's not like they went away, they just kind of moved online and became more wide-reaching. It's like with guys in fraternal organizations. Instead of meeting up with the fellas at the lodge or the bowling alley, now they're meeting up in their Steam or Discord group chats. Like, people don't factor that in when they talk a lot about how we have become more atomized. Look, no one's taken away from that. That is true, insofar as our local communities are concerned. But a big reason for that is a lot of that community has moved online. Do you need a social club when you have your Discord group chat of like 20-some people or more who you're all friends with and you all game on the weekends? I mean, what is that if not the modern equivalent to meeting up with the guys and going bowling or playing pool? I went on a bit of a tangent there, but back to the topic at hand. Here in the United States, you have a sentiment among some young conservatives that the cool, based, and trad thing to do is to get married, buy a farm, and have 7 kids ASAP. It's already something that a lot of people consider cool, quote-unquote. But then you look at these guys who've been saying this since Trump took office for the first time, that's roughly a decade now, and how many of them have lived up to it? And keep in mind, I don't say this to disparage that lifestyle. For those who pursue this and successfully seek it out, you know, all power to you. That is a wonderful lifestyle to live. It is a healthy lifestyle to live. But who I criticize are the people who will say these things and never act upon them. The people for who this is just a matter of points. Of, yeah, look at me, I'm trad, I'm traditional, I'm going for this, and that, and then, you know, those values fall apart when put into actual practice because they don't believe in them. They don't actually care about them, but it is an aesthetic thing. That's sort of the whole crux of this. It's not a matter that living this lifestyle is unpopular. It is quite popular in various circles. It's just people don't seem to have the will to actually go through with it. You can try to make it a cool cultural thing, and that's already sort of been what's going on. But you're living the results of that. You're living in that a decade later. And this is where we are. You have a large population of young people who have internalized this, or at least openly expressed that this is the cool thing to do, yet they don't do it. And you know, maybe they will get married, and maybe they'll have 2 kids, but that's only when Trump finally gets his baby bonus policy through, and maybe once they get the right job and they save enough for a house. It's not really about that. It seems very clear to me that for much of Generation Z, at least here in the United States, many of the milestones earlier generations hit in their 20s won't be hit until they get into their 30s. Buying a house, getting married, having kids, and part of that's because of a prolonged adolescence, where a lot of Gen Z in their 20s don't feel like they're really adults yet. They still feel like they're figuring things out and don't really have any urgency to do anything because, relatively speaking, the world is kinda stable. It's easy to forget that these lives are ours to live at our own pace, and the anxiety many feel, at least young men I should say, about locking all of this down within a certain window of time, it does nothing but diminish the quality of our day-to-day. Have kids, and as many kids with the one you love because you love them, not because it's some task to check off before you turn 30. And again, I stress that more so for guys. Girls are on a bit more of a tight schedule when it comes to that because, of course, how fertility works. But for young guys, don't stress about it. Let's get back to the meat and potatoes of the demographic crisis. We can't really stop it. Populations look like they're going to keep declining for a while, but that doesn't mean it's going to keep going down until 0. That would be the almost impossibly unlikely worst-case scenario. Just as with natural climate change, the solution isn't to try to keep things exactly as they are, the solution is to adapt. Recognize that we live in a changing world, in a changing universe, and it's on us to adapt to that change, not to desperately try to manipulate forces beyond our control. The first big thing you'll want to adapt to is going to be that labor shortage. If your population is shrinking, you need to be able to maximize what each worker can do, and lucky for us, we're in the perfect spot for that. AI, automation, quantum computing, we're in and progressing through an age of innovation in which the amount of work a single laborer can do is growing exponentially. The modern factory sees heavy lifting primarily done by machines and coordinated by a handful of human workers. Some have even become what are known as dark factories, which operate 24/7 and without any lights because all or nearly all of the labor is conducted by machines. It's really short-sighted to say we must import foreign labor because we're going to run out of low-skilled labor. Even translating this over to high-skilled labor is kind of absurd, not only because you're shortchanging American workers, but because, again, tech innovation increases the capabilities of every worker. It's quite possible that within 2 decades, the average laborer will be able to perform about 10,000 to 100,000 times the labor, if not more, of a single worker in 1950, without much more effort. One skilled worker operating an entire factory of machines all on his own, that's no longer in the realm of science fiction. It's a reality that we're catching up with. And what of the technician, the bean counter, the software developer? Yes, technology is exponentially growing what they can do as well. You have AI programs that can write 1,000 lines of code in a minute. That's something that might have taken a coder hours or days to do. You have systems that can take a photograph and identify various parts of a contraption, maybe your car, and walk you through the process of how to repair something or build something. When it comes to our productiveness, our ability to work, and in turn, our ability to maintain a stable economy and quality of life, we're going to be fine as long as we keep on the developmental path we're already on and keep building it better. There's basically no reasonable argument for immigration at that point unless you actively want to change the demographic makeup of your country, and keep in mind, in a situation where populations start declining, there's nothing but negatives to be drawn from that. Remember that a shrinking population means more housing than ever is going to be available, which means housing prices are going to go down dramatically, unless, of course, you feel the need to bring more people into the country, even though machines can do what they're doing. Machines don't need housing, machines aren't going to drive your home prices up 200%, but immigration will. Then you also have the issue of clashing cultures and competition, and you can argue up and down about assimilation, but for a country like, say, the United States, assimilation has never really worked for us. I have a whole video about that here. But basically, the cultures that come over to America end up becoming small microcultures within the bigger, basically American empire. Even Vivek Ramaswamy seems to imply that foreigners have a superior culture to America, and that's why we need to import more of them, essentially saying that, yeah, he wants to change America's culture, and more immigration will do that. We don't need clashing cultures within our country, especially if we're going to be dealing with a big issue like population decline. Better to keep the stable culture or cultures that are here and not upset the balance by adding new groups who are going to compete for jobs, compete for housing, compete for status, and who realistically will be looking toward their own interests as a group. Even geopolitically, this is a bad idea because you're effectively brain draining every other country and dooming them to decline. It's really not beneficial to any party involved. The fear that the human population is just going to go extinct is, again, an extreme and unreasonable fear. Projections have the total population set to continue rising until 2070, just about, and by 2100 the global population is expected to fall back to where it is today. And by 2200 the global population will be where it was in 1987. That's not too scary of a thought. But then there's the question of, well, will our civilization survive this? Will countries with an especially low birth rate like South Korea, or Japan, or France, or England survive culturally? And the answer is simple. Yes, so long as they cease all foreign immigration and they're not invaded. The problem with Japan, France, and England isn't that their domestic population is shrinking. That is something the world at large is facing or will be facing soon enough. And technological advancements will allow for continued economic stability and productivity. However, if you import so many foreigners that the domestic culture becomes overshadowed by the imported culture, yeah, that's a problem. And they're inflicting that on themselves. Very unnecessarily, mind you. Japan has the 11th largest population in the world, France has the 20th, Britain the 21st. We're talking about several tens of millions, and in Japan's case, over 100 million people. You can survive as a civilization if your population gradually goes from 60 million to 40 million over the course of 2 centuries. That's nowhere near extinction risk, and 2 centuries is a lot of time to turn things around. But the question then becomes, again, with immigration, are those 60 million all part of your culture, and will they preserve it into the future, or are 25% of them foreigners who, as of right now, have a higher birth rate than the native-born population? Well, then by 2200 you probably won't have 40 million, you'll have maybe 10 million, the imported culture will have 10 million descendants, and maybe 20 million will be an amalgamation of the two. Still, 10 million isn't a bad number. You're basically as big a population as Israel is today, but again, it could be significantly more if you cut off immigration and you save yourself the risk of potential infighting along the way, which is always possible when you have competing groups in the same country. I really wouldn't worry too much about the birth rate situation. As I said, this is one of those things where we're just going to have to adapt to it, and as countries, the smart way to do that would be to go all in on automation and to heavily restrict or totally cut off all immigration. That way, yes, even if your country's population shrinks, that population is still 100% your country. But wait, why is the demographic crisis happening? Why are fertility rates and birth rates falling across the world? Yes, environmental pollutants are a likely contributor. Yes, cultural norms which prioritize careers over families are big contributors, especially in the developed world. Yes, economics do play a role, albeit not in the way most would think. The short answer is civilization. Civilization is both what has brought us this far and keeps pushing us forward, but it's also the root of our problems. If we look at the animal kingdom, we notice an interesting trend. Wild animals, when compared to the same animals in captivity, reproduce more often. When we look at humans, both in contemporary times and across history, populations of man under poorer or harsher conditions to their wealthier counterparts also follow this pattern. Humans under harsher conditions actually reproduce more than those under wealthier, stabler conditions. My persuasion is that there is a Goldilocks zone at play here. Man living purely in the wild like an animal, say under hunter-gatherer circumstances, would be under threat of predation, would be limited in terms of the nutrition he can receive, and would be under intense stresses, all of which might contribute to lower birth rates. That's certainly the conclusion some zoologists have come to as for why some wild animals reproduce less frequently than others. However, when we look at sedentary agricultural societies, things change dramatically. While hunter-gatherers were believed to have between 4 and 6 children, early farmers and arguably agricultural populations across most of history are generally estimated to have had an average of 6 to 10 children, nearly double that of the wild hunter-gatherers. And this almost seems to invert what we see in the animal kingdom, where captive populations display a fertility rate of about half that of their wild counterparts. Consider this, however. Sedentary human populations tend to build fortifications and are safer from predation. They have a reliable and plentiful source of nutrition, and the stress of survival is significantly lessened. That being said, natural pressures are still at work upon man's mind and body, working him into natural cycles. The same cannot be said of captive animals, however, who are almost fully sheltered from natural pressures, and their natural cycles thusly are impeded. As urbanization and further development of settlements continued forward, that fertility rate gradually fell back to about 4 or 5, but remained relatively high in agricultural regions. Many will argue the Industrial Revolution brought a massive rise to fertility rates, and it did for a short period of time, but what it really did was boost the population by reducing child mortality rates. See, for all those families having several children, only a handful would survive until adulthood, but now, most of them were crossing that line, and soon after this trend, that birth rate began to steadily decline. France was one of the earliest to suffer the effects of this in the late 1800s, and that's why they adopted hardcore pro-family and natalist policies as early as they had, with little to show for it. Low fertility rates would continue to plague France until the end of World War II, until it again began declining in the 70s. So here's where we get to the end cap on the other side of the wild man, being hyper-civilized, and the effects go beyond just psychological, it's very physical, as we now spend more time in man-made spaces than probably ever before. We've become the captive animals, and we are the ones holding ourselves in captivity. Man's body was not made for hot showers, indoor living, and hyper-sedentary life. I mean, people wonder why sperm counts are falling while swimming in pools of bleach, for crying out loud. That's kind of ridiculous. Pretty much everything that's man-made is something your body and mind isn't adapted to, and as we've advanced, as we've surrounded and inundated ourselves with more and more of this stuff, it takes more of a toll on us. That's the physical side of things, but there's also the psychological side, which is the more civilized we get, the more we overthink things, the more we feel we need to restrain ourselves. You've somehow turned easy living into an experience as stressful as being hunted by predators and gathering enough berries to not starve, even though life now is less about survival and more about comfort. That's part of what civilization is about, though, making life easier. So if your mind is fixed on how you can make your future easier, you're going to hesitate a whole lot more about having kids because it's a responsibility. No matter how much you get paid by the government, it's still a big responsibility, and it's a daunting bridge to cross for anyone who's doing it for the first time. Civilized society, hyper-civilized society, reintroduces all of these stressors because it's stuff that's kind of alien to us. Yeah, this is man-made society, but it's not really natural per se. We're all ordering ourselves into these molds that are really difficult for us to fit into. And that takes a toll on the human mind. It's not like early sedentary agricultural society, where yeah, life is physically stressful, it is laborious. But at the same time, it's sort of simple, it's safe, it's predictable. There's enough of the natural world in there, paired with the security that mankind's creations provide. But you go to either side of the spectrum and the fertility rates begin to decline, because at both sides of that spectrum is more and more stress and pressure. There is a Goldilocks zone, but it's becoming increasingly scarce in the modern day. Now, historically, a big factor driving high fertility rate, without fail, is level of primitivism, or more accurately, harsh living conditions. Not so harsh that you have to worry about starvation, but maybe harsh enough that if you don't work hard, you might go hungry. I spoke a lot about agrarian societies, but this applies for people living in cities as well. Think Irish and Italian immigrants in New York City, for instance. If you have two populations, one wealthy and one poor, one educated and the other not, the latter will almost always outbreed the other. Psychological and physical factors come into play. Obviously, a poorer, less educated population isn't going to overthink things like having sex and starting a family. Some people will suggest that prior to the Industrial Revolution, it was the inverse, that it was the elite who had more children, but this is kind of wrong. The elite often had more children surviving into adulthood, but the poor were still having far more children. And you can basically chalk this up to the resources they had at their disposal. On top of that, the elite class typically based their marriages on power plays and long-term strategy. You take away a lot of the romantic motivators and drives that would lead to larger families and more reproduction when you're just marrying somebody for strategic purposes. Of course, there's also the common risk inbreeding played both in infertility and in sickly children for the elite. There was the concern of having too many heirs to divide one's inheritance between and diluting the family wealth. You can see what happens here. Historically in the United States, you saw much the same thing happen. As a lot of the older populations moved up in the class hierarchy, they had fewer and fewer children, and naturally they became threatened when poor populations from Ireland, Germany, Italy, and elsewhere showed up with 5, 6, or 7 children. Similar to what their ancestors were having just several decades prior when their lifestyles were still hard and rugged. Another interesting but less consistent factor, I guess you could kind of nest this under harsher living conditions, is the matter of existential threat. Existential threat that is the risk of being eradicated, exterminated, wiped out. Recurrently, this is a powerful driver for high fertility rate across history. When a population senses that they are attacked, isolated, or vulnerable, they'll put more stock into themselves, they feel a need to propagate and protect themselves. Consider Ireland upon conquest by England. The Jews and Palestinians following the creation of Israel as a state. The Kurds struggling to establish a homeland for years and opposed on all sides, one of the highest birth rates in the Middle East today. China following its Great Leap Forward, a self-imposed mass die-off, saw its birth rate more than double in the years following. There's also the famous post-war booms I'm sure we're all familiar with, which hand in hand with existential threat almost makes it seem like extreme difficulty does actually raise fertility rates. If I were to wager, I'd guess a combination of nationalistic or tribal zeal combined with a removal of some of the civilizing comforts we're used to probably leads to this result, but again, it's not a particularly consistent factor, just a somewhat recurrent one. I would say long-term, the only clear solution or means to turning this trend around is to do precisely what I said at the very beginning: adapt. We need to learn to balance our advancing ways of life with who and what we are as a species. As quickly as we're civilizing and advancing technologically, the hardware that is humanity, that we are, it can only do so much. Trying to force too many of these outcomes in raising the birth rate might end up having the inverse effect, or may just have a small short-term improvement before regressing back to what it was before. Ultimately, I think we're going to be okay. Even in more extreme projections, we'll still have a very large population overall, even 200 years from now. No matter how you slice it, I think ultimately, we're gonna be just fine. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you think in the comments below, like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.